There could be a hacker working their way into your backup server right now. Not because your firewall failed, but because nobody ever even bothered to change the password on the box. Today, Prasanna and I sit down with Mike Saylor to talk about backup security best practices, the stuff that most teams skip, mainly because backups are invisible until they're not. We're talking about things like default passwords on backup hardware, service accounts that nobody's looking at, admin logins at 2 o'clock in the morning, and why passkeys beat MFA. There's a real story in here about a red teamer who broke into a company through their backup system and walked out the front door with the domain controller. If this is your first time watching or listening to me, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. I've been obsessing about backup, recovery, and now cyber recovery for over 30 years. If that's your bag, then I'm your guy. You're not going to find anyone that cares about this topic more than me. Ever since 1993, when I had to tell my boss that there were no backups of the database that we had just lost. Now I've written 5 O'Reilly books, a blog, and a podcast. Here we turn unappreciated admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Hi, and welcome to the Backup Wrap-Up. I'm your host, W. Curtis Preston, and today I have my 2 besties with me. We've got Prasanna, Mr. Getting More Gray Hair Every Day, and Mike, my fellow gray-haired enthusiast. How's it going, Mike?
It's going great. Thanks for having me. Good to catch up with you guys.
So I have a question, Curtis.
What's that?
Is it better to have natural gray, or is it better to dye your hair? That's always been like the constant debate, and I think men typically don't dye versus women, right? I'm just going.
Right.
That's probably generalization.
Great question, Prasanna. 2 little stories to answer that question. Clearly, I've gone with natural, clearly. And there was a minute there where I tried some, like the kind that it's just supposed to subtly dye your hair before I went completely gray. And I did it, and my wife didn't even notice. So I was like, then what's even the point? And then the other thing was I was talking to her one day and I was like, my wife is Filipino, for those that don't know. And I said, one good thing about Filipino, you guys, like your hair like stays black forever. And she looked at me and she goes, you know, we dye it, right? And I'm like, oh my God.
Oh, Curtis.
That's great.
Typical dude. Anyway, all right. So we are back to our series of basically working through our new book that Mike and I came out with, which is Learning Ransomware Response and Recovery. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can see a giant version of that over my shoulder there. And if you're not checking us out on YouTube, you should definitely check out our channel. And of course, we also have the shorts version. We do 30-second to a minute and a half short clips, which are doing really well. And we get a lot of commentary on them. Sometimes not good, but sometimes people have no problem with expressing their opinion to a random stranger on the internet because they're generally people that don't know who we are. And so they just see me making a random claim and then they want to argue with me, which is fine.
You want discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, more interaction. And any comment, even if the comment is you're a freaking idiot, it builds engagement. So comments are good. But today,
or your co-host has amazing hair.
Yeah, we did.
You're talking about me? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we did get a comment about your hair is gorgeous, and I knew he was talking about you. But so speaking of the book, there's a quote in there from one of our podcast guests, which was Duane Lafleur. Duane is he's a red team person, right? He hacks companies on purpose as requested by the companies. I once again will mention the movie Sneakers. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's not obviously it's movies, but it does a pretty good job of showing what red teaming is. And there's a few late great actors in there, specifically Robert Redford, and a great. Yeah. But Duane talked about how he loved backups, except not for the reason I love backups. And that was He loved them because one of the things that we talk about a lot is that backups, because of what they are, where you're either invisible or you're in trouble, because of what they are, they often go ignored from a cybersecurity perspective, right? For a couple of reasons. One is nobody wants to get their hands in there because once you start sticking around the backups, somebody might ask you actually to be the backup person, right? And so there's that. And then because of that, it's often the junior person. So you have the junior person running backups, and the junior person is the one who knows the least about cybersecurity. And today we're going to talk about things that you need to be doing to your backup system. And specifically, we're going to talk about accounts today that are around all the time. We're going to talk about service accounts. We're going to talk about passwords. And he talked about where he was able to penetrate a system, a company, via their backup system. Because what he did was he used some lackadaisical security to take control of the backup system and then use that control to restore the backup server to the storage completely outside of the company's firewall. It was a backup of the domain controller that he restored to outside of their world, where he then had complete control over that server, and he was able to extract all kinds of information. And this is the kind of thing that we talk about a lot in the book, where it's like your backup server, not only does it need to be protected because you need it for recovery when you get hit from a ransomware, but also because it is an exfiltration source, a potential exfiltration source. And so there are unfortunately a lot of default passwords. This is one of the things we're going to talk about. There's a lot of default passwords that are in, especially, I'm going to say, backup hardware. There are some default passwords in some of the backup software, but I think it's less of a problem. But so that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. Prasanna, it sounded like you had something to say there.
I had a question. Yeah. I know you were just talking about default passwords, but I don't think it applies only for the backup space. I don't know if you've seen all the issues people have had with network routers being compromised, being used as botnets for attacks in other places, or as residential proxies. But all of this stems from people not changing the default password when they buy a router, right?
Yeah,
You go buy a
agreed.
wireless access point and you are like, oh, I'll just leave the defaults as it is.
Yeah, agreed. Everything that we're going to say in this episode would also apply to any other network or storage infrastructure, except that this podcast isn't called the network schmet. It's called the backup wrap up. And so we're going to focus on the backup systems. But yeah, Prasanna, you're completely correct that there are a lot of default passwords out there, especially on network equipment. That the good news is, at least with network equipment, there are people that actually want to be network admins. And so they actually study it, and they often tend to be cybersecurity leaning. And so they tend to be a little better at doing this, although clearly not perfect.
Or have been doing it for a longer amount of time than the backup admins have been.
Yeah. Mike, the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of service accounts, and that they're invisible, that they're this thing that's happening, and it's a thing that you can then use to attack things. You want to talk about what service accounts are?
Yeah, the funny thing about service accounts, a lot of times when we red team an organization, even the security services that you're running are susceptible to compromise. So a lot of times we take advantage of like the anti-malware service account, or like a Qualys vulnerability scanner. It's a service account that's got privileges. It's not protected. They're assuming the endpoint is protected. And so when you compromise that account, now you have privilege across all of the endpoints where that agent or service is deployed. It is often overlooked, and it's overlooked for a couple of reasons. One, typically when you deploy a technology that requires a service account, you give it privilege because you want it to work. Shortest path to getting things operational. We don't have to troubleshoot restricted access. Just give it all the access and it'll work. And then we'll pull the access back as needed, but they forget that part. Or often it's overlooked, or we ran out of time, or we ran out of budget, or we've got this other fire that came up we need to go put out, and just gets pushed off the plate. And so, yeah, it's very often.
And Mike, just real quickly, could you help listeners who may not know, like, what is a service account? Because maybe not everyone is familiar with that aspect.
Well, they take a couple of different flavors. The probably the most common one is it's like another user account on the network. So there's Mike at company.com, and then there's at company.com. So it's another user account in the network, and you have to know the credentials to log into it and use it. Sometimes that's just filed away somewhere in a password vault or somebody's desk, and you don't have to log into it because once it's running, it just runs until you need to make a change.
And some of those
And then the
accounts,
other,
Mike, some of those accounts, if they're created by the backup software itself, they could indeed have like default passwords that the backup software put in there.
certainly. And that leads it to the next type, and that's more of an agent-based software. So you install a piece of software on the computer, it has its own credentials, and you authenticate it back to a console like your backup console, your antivirus console, and it runs on that endpoint with those credentials. And often, back to the initial comment, often it's a privileged account.
Yeah, because if you think about backups, in order for backups to do their job, they have to have super user access. They have to be able to access all files in order to both first to be able to back them up, but also just as importantly, to be able to restore them. You have to have write level access to all the accounts. And that does bring me back. I'll pick on what back in the day was my favorite product was NetBackup. And they had a tool called BPGP. I did find out they definitely eventually got rid of this tool, but it was originally called BPCP. BP was the Backup Plus, the original name of the product. And if you were on the backup server, you could use BPCP to read or write any file, transfer from any file from any client where that daemon was running. And so it just made it really easy. Even with the software, with most backup software products, you can use the software to back up a file, then restore it locally, but BPCP made it possible to just do it in one step. And that just gives you an idea of the kind of thing that you could do if you have this.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And if I could add two comments real quick. One, since you brought it up, is it pronounced demon or daemon?
I say demon,
I
but
say daemon.
Of course you do. You're a backup guy.
yeah, it is spelled daemon. I don't know. By the way, it's also pronounced Linux, based on the fact that it came from Linus.
I will never pronounce it that way.
I will never pronounce it that way either, but it is based on the name of the guy who wrote it initially, whose name is
That's
pronounced
fair.
Linus, or whatever. Anyway,
The last thing I'll add on default passwords, there's another problem or a variation of the default password situation, and that's coincidental password. So maybe the password has been changed, but it's the same password that's used for a lot of other things. So this admin account password is the same as that admin password. But then also when you get to managed service providers, so maybe you outsource IT management, that IT management company may be using the same backup password for your environment that as the same password they're using at another company's environment.
that hurts my head.
And
to
so
think of
in
that.
today's world, very similarly, bad guys are looking for the shortest path with the most value. So if I'm going to if I know to look for backups and that's where all the data is, I'm going to look at managed service providers because that's where all the passwords are. Right. So if I compromise one managed service provider, I likely have access to many client environments.
There was a thing, and this was several years ago, but there was a dentist MSP.
Office.
I remember that they hacked the MSP, and as a result, they were able to hack hundreds of dentists around the country.
That's right.
So for these service account mics, because when it gets deployed to your environment, you're going to have multiple agents deployed across all of these systems in order to be able to back up and restore them. Are each of these service accounts across all of the individual machines uniquely protected, or do they have unique passwords, or is it typically a single service account which might be local to a particular machine, might share a common password with another service account on a different machine?
Typically, and I would say typically putting that in the 90 percentile range, the passwords are the same. I think there are some highly regulated and possibly highly more secure environments where you could assign unique passwords, but that's definitely the exception.
That's probably more management, more complexity, all the rest of that.
For sure. For sure.
So it's bad enough if we are able to compromise a single account. What then, let's talk about privilege escalation, Mike. What is privilege escalation and what could someone do once they achieve that?
So privilege escalation is taking whatever access you're able to gain at whatever level, normal user, guest, super user, admin, global admin, and get to that next level. And sometimes we talk about privilege escalation, but sometimes you can actually justify demotion for a particular objective. So maybe I want to pretend I'm Curtis. So I'm global admin. I have that ability. I can now give myself access to a demoted account like Curtis, normal user, in order to use Curtis's identity to achieve whatever. But the promotion part or the escalation part is I am Curtis and I want to be an admin. So I'm using Curtis's local permissions on his computer or his network permissions to find, and recon is always the first phase, find those service accounts, find those accounts that have default passwords, and then escalate to that. And that, whether that's straight to admin or an administrative privileged account or some series of stepping stones to get there.
The thing from a backup perspective that I want people to understand is that almost every backup software product that I worked with has the idea of a pre and a post script, right? So if you can put a script in the appropriate place, the backup software will run that script as the privileged account that backup runs at. So if you basically create a script, it creates a user that gives you the permission that you want, the backup, and put it in the right place, backup will then use that, will run that script for you. And then you can put in the script to clean up behind yourself, right? So this is just something you need to be aware of. You should be looking for these scripts, that you should be checking that if there aren't any of these scripts, you should be looking to make sure that they don't magically appear, right? And then also, if you are using these scripts, you should make sure that that they don't change on you.
You know, Curtis or Mike, if any of these backup systems actually look to see if a script has been changed, like outside. I'm just imagining the case that someone goes, like, a script is defined, a pre-script, they go behind the scenes to the file system, they change the script, they haven't changed the name of it, right? But is there any backup software that actually does like a verification to ensure that like a script has not changed between when the admin actually configured it versus now?
Yeah, I certainly don't know of any that do that. But I tell you what, we've got a lot of listeners and a lot of them are vendor people. So if you're aware of a product that does do that, that checks the scripts, that, that it would be, what would be really nice is to make sure that the first time a new script is run, we send up some authentication and say, hey, is this what you intended to do? And you do 4 eyes authentication, which is where you have to have 2 people to authenticate that. That would be nice. It would also be nice to do what you're suggesting, which is checking to make sure that the script that we're running is the same as this. You could do that by fingerprinting and all that kind of stuff. But so this is just something to look into. And then let's talk about, go ahead.
Real quick on that. I'm not familiar with a backup solution that does that, but there are third-party tools that do file integrity monitoring. So they'll look for changes in the hash, changes in the configuration. Tripwire used to do that. I don't know what they're called today. But then a lot of security monitoring tools, you can point at an object, whether that's a file or a folder or metadata, and it'll alert you when something changes.
Because all those, the ones that I'm aware of, you would put the script in a particular predictable place. And so you could monitor for that. So let's talk about something that I talk a lot about, Mike, and that is this idea that the backup system should not share any credentials with the production environment, right? That we don't put it in the Active Directory domain, for example. Why is that the case?
Well, it goes back to that idea or the concept of putting as many layers of security and obfuscation and really just extra effort as you can to not only deter and potentially hinder, but also give you time to identify when weird things are happening. So for example, if you've got your backup system on a separate network, like a management network. So all your servers, you'd have two network interfaces, one for production and one for backup and management. All day long, your production network interface is just super busy and it's dynamic. There's just tons of activity and that's needle in a haystack looking for bad actors. But on your management interface, that's like, you can baseline that. You know exactly what's going on there, when to expect backups, what bandwidth looks like, connections, and all those things. So much less dynamic traffic on that interface and much easier to identify when weird things are happening. So there's that. Then on the Active Directory side, let's just take the example that you brought up where a bad guy was able to get a copy of a domain controller. Then the domain controller has all the privileged accounts. And some of those are, you just have to have, like your global admin and Office 365 Exchange admin. All those things are in your normal Active Directory and they need to be. But some of these others, like your backup admin, maybe your cybersecurity tools, some of those other things, recovery accounts. So if someone does compromise your domain, you've got this other interface with separate credentials that you might be able to reacquire some of those servers or part of your network.
Yeah, I like that separate network. I've always been a fan of the separate network for backup traffic, more so back when that really meant that the backup system could get a predictable amount of bandwidth. But now, and what's really nice about it now is that we can do this. This is part of infrastructure as code, right? That you can just literally, as you're creating your VMs in the cloud, you can create them this way. And you say all backup traffic goes through this port and production traffic goes through that port. Prasanna,
Do
you
you
had a
actually
look on your face.
see that in production today, Mike?
No.
I
Sorry,
wonder if
you're
a
asking
lot of
Mike.
this, like, sort of, because I know, like, ideally, it is best practice to have, like, separate management network, backup network, and production network. But that's also, like, time-consuming to set up and manage over time and everything else. And also in the world of virtual machines where it could be easier, but it's also still a bit of a pain. And so are you actually seeing people continue to have these, like, isolated networks that they use?
I haven't seen any new ones. A lot of the ones that are out there have been there for a
Mhm.
while, mostly in telecom. And your backup strategy, your management strategy is going to drive that architecture. In the environments where I've seen the separate interface, their backup jobs were huge. And even having the separate interface and better bandwidth, they still struggled with backup jobs completing before the next business day. So that was primarily the driver for the strategy for those organizations. How do we make our backup strategy effective instead of thinking we need a new strategy? And then probably more recently today, they're all mostly VLANs instead of physical network interfaces.
Yeah, that's a good point. You want to just cover what a VLAN is real quick for those that are not familiar with that?
Yeah, so a VLAN is it's a virtual network, but it's run off of one appliance. And so if you think about a switch with, let's just 1632 ports that you would plug in your network cables to, when you log into that switch, the interface for that allows you to assign or create these virtual networks so that network jack, Ethernet jack 1 through 6 is VLAN 1. And now you can create access lists and restrictions, whether it's computer in VLAN 1 cannot talk to any other computers and vice versa. So it's isolated. But you can also restrict the type of traffic. We don't allow people in VLAN 1 to receive internet traffic. We restrict that, both normal HTML and the encrypted 443 ports and those protocols. So you can do a lot with VLANs from another layer of network management and security. And then a computer, a server, again, if you had two network interfaces or even a virtual network interface, now that we're talking about virtual machines, you can connect that one computer to one to many virtual networks through that VLANing switch.
So this is the way we can segregate the traffic, even though we only have one actual interface.
Yeah.
If you think about most consumer Wi-Fi devices or routers these days, right? You have a guest network and you have your normal, right? And that is a form of network segregation. I'm sure they're using VLANs or something under the covers as well.
All right. So let's just let's review basically the things that people can do to help with this problem. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the easy one, which is go look for and change all the default passwords, right? Think about all of these backup, especially backup service accounts. Prasanna, you mentioned network infrastructure. I'd say storage infrastructure. Servers don't tend to have, because unless it's an appliance server that you bought, they don't tend to have default passwords, although I suppose like a particular distribution might have that. Any other default passwords, Mike, that you can think of that people should go be looking to change?
Just about anything comes with a default password, whether it's blank or password
Right.
or admin or the name of the product. And there may also be a support account. So if you need help, you're going to call a number or get on a website, and they're going to be able to remote connect in using their support account. My recommendation to all of those support situations, turn it off until you need help. Don't just leave it on, because those are just like home security systems. A contractor now, it's not even the company that installs it now. They hire contractors that come out and install your home security system, and the default, key or password is 1111 or what have you. And you can put in your new code 1234, but unless you delete or disable the original code, it's still there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Go ahead.
One thing though, so I have a sprawling enterprise network, right, with a whole bunch of devices. How am I supposed to figure out what has default passwords and what doesn't? Is there a tool out there that can look across my entire network and say, hey, this is the type of device you have. Okay, let me try its default.
A vulnerability scanner like Nessus. There's an open source version of Nessus. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it's good enough.
Spell that, Mike.
Make sure you read the NESSUS, Nessus. Make sure you read the manual or watch some YouTube videos before you run it, because it can be disruptive if you don't configure it well. But there are plugins for our switches to turn on to test for default passwords. And those are traditional network devices like switches, routers, servers, some software. And then for OT, operational technology related hardware like SCADA devices and thermostats and printers and smart boards, there are other tools that are more current on configurations and passwords for those.
To go back to your support account, I can give a shout out to Rubrik here. One of the things I know, and maybe there's other products that do this, but I just know in the case of Rubrik, they're not able to connect from the outside to the support account. They require you to do an SSH tunnel. The server is set up, or the appliance is set up in such a way that you can't connect to the outside on that account. And it would be, if it's possible for you to do that. And by the way, if you guys are aware of other backup software or backup hardware products that do that same concept, I like that as well, that the account is set up in such a way that you cannot connect to it from the outside. I like that a lot. Another thing,
and just continuing that, continuing that thought and enhancing my previous comment about turning stuff off when you don't need it. That includes public facing services. So if a vendor does need to SSH or VPN in to help you address a problem, those services should only be enabled and turned on when they're needed.
Agreed.
Not just all.
Agreed. Especially my favorite service, RDP, the ransomware deployment protocol.
Two other things I'd like to add real quick is one of the other situations that we run into a lot is backup admin is running day-to-day operations as backup admin. So he's checking his email, he's surfing the internet, and that's the admin account. And so good best practice is Bob backup admin has a normal Bob account that's not an admin.
Right.
And that's what he's doing day-to-day stuff in. And then he's got to log into Bob, the backup admin, to do backup admin stuff.
Like that.
Painful, Mike.
And then the last thing I'll mention, because if this happened, your red team example earlier would have been more difficult, if not preventable. Encrypt your backups and have different credentials for the decryption part.
Yeah, agreed. Now, in the case of this particular red team, he was able to actually take control of the backup server. And so encryption doesn't help at that point, right? He didn't steal backups. Yep. He stole the backup server, right?
And I think that's a common misconception for people that think my data is encrypted. It's only encrypted when you're not using it,
right?
Because you can't work on encrypted data. We're not that smart.
Yeah,
so when you log in or authenticate to a system that's encrypted, it becomes unencrypted so that you can use it.
By the way, along the same lines as admin, also, if your account if your admin account doesn't need to be named admin, then change that, right? Again, don't make it the default username or the default password, right?
Make it that
Admin.
easy.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then we can also just talk about just hardening everything, but especially the management plane and especially backup stuff. And that is, if you're not using either MFA or passkeys on your security infrastructure and your backup infrastructure, it's time to do that, right? Prasanna, you want to remind us what MFA is and why we care?
Yeah. MFA is multi-factor authentication. So you see this everywhere, right? It's like you log in using your password and it's, please touch your keypad, right? The biometric sensor in order to know it's you, or look at the Face ID. So it knows it's you. And so this way you have multiple ways to authenticate that it's just you. It's not just the password you know, but it's also who you are. And so that's multi-factor authentication. Passkey is, I don't know what I would call it. It's like passwords on steroids because you don't really need to know the password anymore, right? It's the ability to tie a particular device to a particular website such that you no longer necessarily need to use a password whenever you are accessing that. It's tied, and once again, it uses sort of MFA or biometrics in order to do the initial establishing of the authentication. But after that, it's automatic.
Yeah, so you have to
That I do.
authenticate yourself to the device, and the device
Yeah.
authenticates itself. Mike, just curious, one thing I've noticed lately has been random companies that I interface with, and they've done away with passwords, but they've replaced it with, we're going to email you a one-time code. And I'm like, this isn't better. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I agree. Given enough reconnaissance and time, bad guys are going to figure that out for that organization. And if it also depends on whether, are you emailing it to my personal account? Are you emailing it to my work account? Are you requiring me to go set up a new account like that I don't use for anything else? There's ways of doing that, and each one of them have pros and cons.
Yeah.
But long story short, MFA really needs to be what would be considered out of bounds communication. So not normal. So like an authenticator app on your phone is probably the better. So you've got to have and set it up with layers also. So my authenticator app requires a PIN to get into the authenticator app in order to get the code to use as MFA to get into whatever site. But preempting all of that, making sure that policy does not allow me to bypass MFA because I now trust this device or remember me or any of those other things that would then store an MFA token in a browser or on this computer to be trusted again in the future. MFA has to happen every time in order to be effective.
Once again, Mike, I so often learn random stuff from you that this is the one today, and that is, I didn't know that my particular authenticator app does not require a PIN, and I like that idea a lot. I'm going to go check to see if it supports it, and then perhaps I just haven't turned it on. Similar to back in the day when you talked about having a separate browser for our separate browser session, and the way I did it was I take my accounts that matter and I run it on a completely different browser. And then I use Chrome as my regular browser. And then I use a different browser for that stuff. And I actually installed a Chrome plugin that if I go to any of those accounts that matter, it says, hey, you're not supposed to be over here. You're supposed to be over there in the other place, right? So I love it when I've been doing this a while, and I love it when I learn stuff new. This particular old
along those lines,
new tricks. What was that, Mike?
Similar to your plugin on the company network, if you're diligent about making sure that your admins are using the admin account only when they're doing admin stuff, you can monitor, like alert. Every time an admin logs in, someone should know. It gets logged. And then over time, you've got a baseline. Like admins, 99% of the time, they're only logging into the admin account Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, maybe Saturday to do some work. But so if you can baseline that activity along with having visibility into it, again, you can start to look for anomalies. Someone admin logged in at 2 a.m. We should call the admin and see if that's really them. And if it's a one-off thing, then that's easy to manage. Then on the audit or even incident response side, if you're looking backwards about in time for activity about an admin account, you should be able to tie admin logged in. Is there a ticket associated with that? Was there a change in the backup system? Was there a break fix, a new install, a new config? Is there a ticket for that? So that goes back to general controls. And are we actually doing these good? Am I following the change management or patch management policy or what have you? So from an audit perspective, there's that. Then incident response also, if it's an admin and we're logging those activities, that's going to help us build the picture for how this happened and when it happened and
Yeah.
all that stuff.
And you can also, a very common thing to do is to prevent the ability to log in directly as the admin account, right? You can say, you can establish that. You have to start with establishing that as a policy, right? And then there are technological things that you can do to simply prevent a person from logging in directly to the admin account. They have to log in as themselves and then become the admin account. And that even if you can't prevent it, you can, again, like you said, monitor for that. So if anybody does directly monitor into the admin account, that's an event, right? That you need to go research, and maybe it's just your employee, it's 2 a.m. and they're half asleep and they don't know what they're doing, but maybe it's a bad guy.
I had the opposite situation go where we were seeing failed login attempts to an admin account every Thursday morning. And we would escalate that to the client. They would go look at it. They'd close the ticket, but we wouldn't get any feedback. But every Thursday morning, there were these failed admin account logins. And it was because their admin was going through a tough patch and would go get drunk every Wednesday night and come in Thursday morning and have trouble remembering his password. So eventually we heard the whole story, but that's...
Curtis, one of the things you talked about MFA and passkeys at the beginning.
Yeah.
Do you know of any backup systems that use passkeys?
I know that there are some that support it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think what some of them do is they outsource it to, if you're going to use an OTP, right? You're going to use something like Okta, right? They're going to use some sort of SSO, right? Single sign-on package, and then they outsource it to that. But I am aware of a handful that directly support passkeys. And this is the thing, like if you're not looking into passkeys now, it's the best thing that's available from a security perspective, from a login security perspective. It's better than MFA. If you're using MFA, we're actually going to be doing an upcoming episode we're going to be talking about phishing resistant MFA and why that's a thing and why you need it and what to do. But again, you could just skip it and go straight to passkeys, and that's a good thing. All right. Any final thoughts, Mike?
Be diligent, read the manual, change your password.
There you go. Prasanna?
I got nothing, but I do miss our podcast recordings, so looking forward to the upcoming ones.
Yeah. We took a little break there, and so hopefully the people are enjoying did enjoy the encore episodes that we put out. There were some really good episodes in there, so I hope they enjoyed those. And I'm glad that we're now recording again. All right, folks, thanks for listening. You are why we do this. That is a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.